Good afternoon, class.
Good afternoon, teacher.
This is my 6th lecture on selected readings in British and American poetry. I will talk about John Keats and his sonnet on first looking into Chapman's Homer. Now let me read aloud the poem to you. On first looking into Chapman's Homer. Much have I travelled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told, that deep-browed Homer ruled earth's domain. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene, till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Quadits, when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with wild surmise, silent upon the peak in Darien. This is the agenda I prepared for this afternoon. I first will give a brief introduction to the life of John Keats, and then I will talk briefly about his poetic theories, negative capability, and beauty is truth, truth beauty. And finally, we'll have a close reading of his sonnet on first looking into Chapman's Homer. Keats was born in London in 1795, the son of Thomas Keats, a stable keeper, and Frances Jennings, the daughter of the owner of the stables. In 1803, Keats entered John Clarke's school at Enfield, about 10 miles north of London. This is the picture of this school. The school was small, with only about 75 students, 75 boys in attendance. But surprisingly, it had a wide curriculum than such prestigious public schools as Eton. And its rural location may have fostered John Keats' love of nature. In 1804, John's father was thrown from a horse and died from a skull fracture, leaving 4 small children. His mother then married a bank clerk, whom she soon left, but her second husband sold the stables, and 4 Keats children were left without a home. Then they were sent to live with their maternal grandparents. Keats had 3 siblings, George, Thomas, and Frances Mary. In 1805, Keats' grandfather died, leaving the children without a male protector. And Keats' mother seems to have dropped out of their lives. So their grandmother, Mrs. Jennings, took them into her house. In 1808, Keats' mother returned to her children, but unfortunately, she became seriously ill and died of tuberculosis in 1810. At school, Keats developed a love of reading. In his last 2 or 3 semesters at Enfield, he won several prizes and even began a prose translation of Virgil's Aeneid. At this time, he made a friend of Charles Cowden Clarke, 8 years his senior, who had been his tutor in his first years at Enfield. Clarke was instrumental in fostering a love of music and poetry in Keats. After the death of his mother, Keats' grandmother set up a trust fund for the children. However, the sum involved was not great, and Keats and other children remained in highly straitened circumstances for years to come. In 1810, Keats left school and became apprenticed to Thomas Hammond, a surgeon and apothecary. Although Keats was apprenticed to an apothecary, he soon realized that writing was his true talent. He wanted to become a poet. Not until he was 18 did he become deeply interested in poetry. In 1813, Keats was captivated by Edmund Spenser's poetry and set to imitate Spenser. Keats has often been compared to Edmund Spenser in his richness of description. And this is Edmund Spenser's Fairy Queen in Keats' collection. In 1815, Keats entered Guy's hospitals in London for medical training for just one semester. He was an industrious student and was quickly promoted to dresser, assistant surgeon at the hospital. In July 1816, he passed his examinations and was qualified to practice as an apothecary and a surgeon. Keats' career at Guy's Hospital had been a successful one, but his fascination with poetry was stronger. With the support of his small inheritance, Keats devoted himself to writing poetry. Keats' first poem, To Solitude, was published in the journal Examiner in May 1816. That same year, Keats also wrote his sonnet on first looking into Chapman's Homer, and met many notable literary figures, including Shelley. Keats began associating with artists and writers during this period, including Leigh Hunt, a central figure of the Romantic movement in England, a poet, a translator, and was the editor of the influential magazine called The Examiner. It was Leigh Hunt who published Keats' first poem, To Solitude, in The Examiner in May 1816. This is the page of The Examiner containing Keats' To Solitude. And this is the first draft of the sonnet on first looking into Chapman's Homer in Keats' collection. In 1817, Keats abandoned his plans for a medical career and published his first book, Poems. He also made famous literary critical comments in his letters written to his friends and his younger brothers in November and December in 1817. In 1818, his brother Tom also fell ill with tuberculosis, and Keats nursed him. That same year, he fell in love with Fanny Brawne, a neighbor's daughter, but was prevented from marrying her by her poor health and financial difficulties. Within a few years, Keats had also experienced the first symptoms of tuberculosis, the disease that had killed his mother and would also kill his younger brother. In 1819, Keats wrote most of his great poetry. He was working on Hyperion, a narrative poem, Lamia, play Otto the Great, and he also wrote The Eve of St. Agnes, and all of his major odes, including To a Nightingale, On a Grecian Urn, To Autumn. In 1820, he developed tuberculosis. He was nursed by Fanny Brawne and her mother, and he published a final book of poetry, Lamia Isabella, The Eve of St. Agnes, and other poems, which included his famous odes and the unfinished narrative, Hyperion, a fragment. Hoping to prolong his life, Keats took his doctor's advice and sailed for Italy in September 1820. But the strain of the voyage worsened his condition, and he died in Rome the following spring at the age of 26. This is a picture of the house in Rome where Keats died. And here we have the picture of the towers where Keats spent the last night in England. Now, I'll have a few words about his poetic theory, negative capability. At the time of his death, JohnKeats had only published 54 poems, so his reputation as a great poet was not secure. In his poetry, he struggled to make sense of a world full of misery, heartache, pain, sickness, oppression, and death. Especially toward the end of 1817, when he was, 23 years old, Keats entered a period of intense speculation on the nature of poetry. He tried to develop a theory of negative capability, that is, the ability to exist in a condition of uncertainties, miseries, doubts, etc. In his letters to his brothers and friends, we find him searching for the possibility that by uniting truth and beauty in a single sublime experience, art possesses the power to overcome the world of pain and death and to redeem the man's doubts and uncertainties through a brief spiritual transcendence. By identifying completely with an experience, such as that of perceiving an object, the poet goes beyond the rational meaning of his own existence, his selfhood dropping away in favor of a greater mystery that is revealed in the art itself. In such a way, the doubts and uncertainties, which are part of the self's existence, might also be overcome. So in his letters, Keats wrote often about this possibility, which he called negative capability. That is the ability to exist in the uncertainties, miseries, and doubts. Beauty is truth, truth beauty is also a famous theory of poetry. Keats was horrified by the savage poverty and human degradation he saw among the Scottish and Irish people. As a poet, we know he was too much possessed by the tragic view of man. And as a man, we also know his life was riddled with various tragedies. But Keats believed that poetry is a release from misery, a way toward paradise. The major thoughts and feelings of his poetry were miserable world of human existence, the beautiful world of nature, and also the wonderful realms of poetry and imagination. In his letters to his friend Benjamin Bailey on November 22nd, 1817, Keats said, "I'm certain of nothing but of the holiness of the heart's affections and the truth of imagination." He says, "What the imagination seizes as beauty must be truth. He looked to sensation, passion, imagination for guidance in his life and art. The message conveyed in his poetry, therefore, is the lasting power of beauty and its union with truth. His poetry is almost always sensuous, colorful, rich in imagery, which communicates an acute sense of experience of the poet. His lofty and beautiful words and phrases echoed the musicality from works of such great English writers as Shakespeare and Milton. Ode to a Nightingale is a meditation on the immortal beauty of the nightingale's song and the sadness of the poet, who actually responds to the beauty of the bird's song with both happiness and ache. He seeks to fully identify himself with the nightingale so as to fade away into the forest dim. But his human consciousness separates him from nature and prevents from him the kind of deathless happiness the nightingale enjoys. So the speaker finally accepts the truth of sorrow and mortality. In his ode on the Grecian urn, while he describes the pastoral scenes of love, beauty, and joy illustrated on the urn, Keats reflects on the eternal quality of art and the fleeting nature of human love and happiness. Though all such figures as the musicians, lovers, trees, grass on the urn are quiet forms, they possess the beauty. So at the end of the poem, Keats emphasizes the relationship between beauty and truth by saying beauty is truth, truth beauty, declaring his worship of beauty in the field of art. Now, let's have a close reading of his sonnet on first looking into Chapman's Homer. John Keats wrote altogether 64 sonnets, mostly in the form of Italian sonnet. On first looking into Chapman's Homer is his best-known sonnet. It shows the admiration and wonders he experienced about the antique world of epic heroes when he first read Homer's Iliad in Chapman's translation. As we all know, Keats enjoyed a wide experience of reading poetry, and he was familiar with Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, but not until 1816 had he had the special aesthetic enjoyment from his first reading of Homer in the translation of George Chapman, a contemporary of Shakespeare. Keats' discovery of Chapman's Homer provided him the same kind of overwhelming excitement. An excitement felt by an astronomer who had discovered a new planet, or by Quadits when he first saw the Pacific from the summit in Central America. Keats wrote this famous sonnet when he was only 20 years old and had little experience in writing sonnets. But this sonnet is a fine testimony of the effect of poetry on Keats. This is the story behind the poem. In the autumn of 1816, Keats spent the whole night reading poetry with his friend Charles Cowden Clarke, who introduced him to some of the best passages in Chapman's translation of Homer. Keats was delighted with the vigorous language of the Elizabethan. To him, Chapman spoke out loud and bold. After Keats left Clarke, around daybreak, he walked to his lodgings, sat down at his desk, and wrote his tribute to Chapman, and had a copy of it on his friend's breakfast table by 10 o'clock in the morning. This is the first draft of Keats on first looking into Chapman's Homer. The poem seems to have been composed in a white heat of excitement or in a flash of inspiration. Keats made very few changes in the poem, but the changes he had made will show that he realized that the inspiration is not enough. Now let me read aloud the poem to you again. Much have I travelled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told, that deep-browed Homer ruled earth's domain. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Quaritz, when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, while all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon the peak in Darien. This is a sonnet written in Italian sonnet scheme. We have A, B, B, A, the first quatrain, A, B, B, A, second quatrain, and then we have the logical or emotional term, right? And after the term, we have the sestet, CD, CD, CD. So it was written in form of an Italian sonnet. Now let's have a revision of the structure of an Italian sonnet. This is the rhyme scheme of an Italian sonnet. When we discussed Milton's Sonnet 19 on his blindness, we have a discussion over the structure, the emotional, logical, or semantic structure of an Italian sonnet. In an Italian sonnet, we have octave, the first 8 lines, and sestet, the last 6 lines. And between the octave and the sestet, we have the term, the emotional or logical term. In the octave, we have 2 quatrains, the first quatrains and second quatrains, so A, B, B, A, A, B, B, A, yeah. And in the sestet, the rhyme scheme can be CD, 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 or CDE, CDE. And there are 2 striking characteristics that we need to keep in mind in terms of an Italian sonnet. One is the imbalance. The octave is weightier than the sestet. And the second is the 2-part division of thought is invited. So this is a standard. As we know, a standard Italian sonnet provides the subject in the first quatrain. And in the second quatrain, the poet will expand it sufficiently. And then at the start of the sestet, the poet will project the term, which open up for solution to the problem in the sestet. So in this sonnet, Keats follows strictly the form of an Italian, or we also called a Petrarchan sonnet, with the rhyme scheme ABBA, ABBA, CD, CD, CD. There is a very clear division existing between the octave and the sestet, a change of direction at the beginning of the sestet. Now, let's look at the poem line by line. Much have I travelled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. The realms of gold, what do they mean? The realms of gold here is a metaphor, referring to realms of great books. The poet will compare himself to a searcher of gold who has travelled, of course, in his imagination, to the lands of poetry. And many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Now here, goodly means, well, beautiful. But what will do the states and kingdoms refer to? Goodly means, well, beautiful. And here, the goodly states and kingdoms, they continues the metaphorical idea of realms of gold in the previous line, also referring to the states and kingdoms of great books, which Keats have already read. Keats enjoyed a wide range of reading experience of poetry. Round many western islands have I been. I've been to many western islands. What do these western islands refer to? How do they relate to the states and kingdoms and the realms of gold in the previous lines? Figuratively speaking, the imaginary islands here in the Western world, Western islands, refer to the realms of great poetry. But compare with the world of Homer's epics. These poetical works are only small islands, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Bards means poets. Fealty means allegiance, loyalty. Apollo, of course, Greek god of poetry or god of poetic inspiration. So Apollo is the god of poetry in Greek mythology. And accordingly, the Asian poets of the Western Islands pledged allegiance to Apollo. In the first quatrain, these first 4 lines are a statement of the experience Keats has already had as a reader of poetry. Keats wrote this sonnet when poetry meant more to him than anything else in the world. He was on the point of giving up the security of a career in medicine for uncertainties of a career in poetry. So in Chapman's Homer, Keats excitedly communicates the experience of discovering the realms of gold. Now the second quatrain, out of one wide expanse had I been told, that deep-browed Homer ruled earth's domain. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Wide expanse, vast territory. In contrast with Western Islands, Homer's epics, a wide expanse. So out of one wide expanse had I been told. I have been told about Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, but I've never read it. Deep Brown, of course, refers to Homer, who was meditative, thoughtful, resourceful, as indicated by a well-developed forehead, referring to Homer's profound knowledge and insight. So that deep-browed Homer ruled as his domain. Domain means estate, land property. Of course, is also a metaphor, refers to his epics. And serene means atmosphere, pure atmosphere in Homer's epics. Till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold, and probably, loud and bold. This is probably the only place the poet mentioned about, the translation, Chapman's translation of Homer. And this is a very interesting question. The occasion of this poem is about Keats' reading of Chapman's translation of Homer's epics. But the poet did not talk too much about the translation. This is a question for us to think about. Come back for this question. So in the second quatrain, here the poet expands sufficiently his metaphorical expression of the excitement he experienced in the first reading of Homer's epics. The pure atmosphere in Homer's epics seems to have intoxicated Keats when he heard his friend Clark's reading aloud of some most famous passages from Chapman's translation of Homer. Then a sextant. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken. Watcher of the sky. He compared himself to an astrologer. Notice the excitement of an astrologer when he found a new planet swimming into his sight. So swims into his ken, the range of his sight, comes into the range of his sight. The verb swims describes the way in which the heavenly body will move into the circular lens of an astronomer's telescope, suggesting perfectly, the motion of a planet as seen from the Earth. Ken means the range of sight of knowledge here. So these two lines is the first beautiful simile Keats uses in conveying to the reader the excitement, the thrill of discovery he has experienced in hearing his friend Clark reading from Chapman's translation of Homer to him. So the discovery of a new planet was so rare during that period of time that only one had been made between ancient times and 1781, when Sir William Herschel discovered the planet Uranus. Keats might have Herschel's discovery in mind, but it is very reasonable for Keats to compare his delight in his first looking into Chapman's Homer to the overwhelming excitement of the discoverer of the planet. Or like stout Quoits, when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with wild surmise, silent upon the peak in Darien. Quoits is a Spanish conqueror of Mexico, but in fact it was not Quoits who was the first European to see the Pacific Ocean from Darien in a peak in Panama. Stout is a very good word. Means, well, fearless, with eagle eyes, suggesting that Keats was alert. Perhaps only such a man who was fearless and alert could have discovered the Pacific Ocean. With a wild surmise. This means that Keats' men stood about him and looked at each other with a wild surmise. It seems as if, well, their minds were flooded by a bewildering variety of untold possibilities of discoveries. They were so shocked with emotion, with excitement, that they just, well, stood there bewildered, at loss about what to say. So Keats' term in the sextet is two comparisons in the sextet, taken from astronomy and exploration. The unity and coherence are assured not only by carrying the idea of discovery all the way through the poem, but also by using the linking words like much, line 1, oft, line 5, to begin the two halves of his octave, and the word then to begin his sextet in line 9. Now I have a question. As the title suggests, the occasion of this sonnet was Keats' first reading of a translation of Homer by George Chapman. George Chapman was also an Elizabethan poet. But on our first looking into Keats' sonnet, we may feel we are reading a travel poem rather than a poem about translation, a poem about books. Because, well, Chapman's translation of Homer receives no specific description. So the question will be, why are the details about Chapman's translation of Homer omitted? Why does Keats use imagery of physical exploration instead of specific description of Chapman's translation of Homer? In the first place, the title does refer to a specific lyric work, that is Chapman's Homer. But the subject of the poem is the experience of discovery and exploration rather than translation. Second, the poet, well, does not want to make a comparison between Chapman's translation of Homer with others' translation. So the purpose of the poem is to capture the sensation, the effect of poetry produced in Keats by the work within a limited space of 14 lines. The purpose is to capture the sensation, the excitement, rather than to make a comparative study. In the third place, the poem ends with a specific image of Keats gazing in amazement at the sight of the Pacific, because this is a very physical analog for the excitement and breathless sense of discovery Keats experienced in reading Chapman's Homer. The basic analogy between reading poetry and exploring is established immediately in the first line, when it says, "Much have I traveled in the realms of gold." The metaphor, realms of gold, immediately connotes the power, majesty, and rhetorical splendor of poetry. The poet says that, well, he has read some of the best, most elevated poetry, and that, well, in addition, he has been told of one particular poetic kingdom, Homer's, which he has not yet encountered directly. It is only when he refers to Chapman's speaking loud and bold in line 8 that the poet introduces the occasion of the poem itself. And at this point, the metaphors of discovery surpass the metaphors of exploration. He presents the first general analogy for his sense of discovery upon reading Chapman's Homer. He feels like a stargazer who discovers a new planet. And the last 4 lines introduces a new and more specific analogy, this time providing, through a specific allusion, a particular scene of discovery. The picture of Quartets standing on the mountain top, gazing out to sea, and the focus on visual imagery. You see, the eagle eyes stare at, looked at. It conveyed an almost confusing sensation of discovery, exploration, and vision. So, upon reading Chapman's Homer, Keats experienced such a feeling of excitement and expansiveness. And in the 4th place, we can look at the division, the 2-part division of an Italian sonnet. Keats makes the best use of the formal division of the Italian sonnet form to reinforce the rhetorical progression of the metaphors. After 8 lines, which establish the general analogy between reading poetry and exploring the world, Keats focuses on a specific discovery at the heart of a poem. The climatic image is prepared in the octave of the sonnet. And a column at the end of line 8, column contributes to this emphasis by suggesting that the whole poem has been preparing for the image presented in the sestet. So, as the focus intensifies in the sestet, metaphor is replaced by simile. Keats will use a series of metaphors in octave, but here in the sestet, metaphor is replaced by simile. In the final section, the speaker tries to convey what his experience felt like. This more explicit acknowledgement of the metaphorical process corresponds perfectly with such an amazing excitement of the experience that Quartets and his men were almost found dumb at the spectacle. So I would like to end my lecture today by saying that although not enough attention has been paid to Keats' sonnets, Keats was keenly interested in exploring the art of sonnet. And his first looking into Chapman's Homer is the finest testimony of Keats' talent in writing sonnets. And you are expected to recite the poem next time when we meet. Okay, here we have the assignments for next lecture. Learn by heart this poem. And second, write a journal on Keats' dramatic manipulation of the Italian sonnet form in this poem. Third, read before you come to class Walt Whitman's Oneself I Sing and the first 2 sections of his Song of Myself. Think about the question, why does Whitman sing of oneself rather than myself? in his short poem, Oneself I Sing. Here are some reference books that, well, you can come to in your spare time. Thank you for your patience.